German soldiers were trained to identify every threat. This one had no category, and that made it invisible. This trap took 19 seconds to build. It wiped out a German patrol in less than a minute. But the trap isn't what matters. What matters is why trained soldiers walked straight into it, and why the same mistake kept repeating throughout the war, why no one took traps like this seriously. The patrol didn't blunder into danger because they were careless. They walked into it because nothing about the situation matched their definition of a threat. That distinction matters. By the time these men moved through the area, they had already survived months of combat. They had seen mines, ambushes, artillery kill zones, sniper lanes. They knew what danger looked like. Danger was complex. Danger took time to prepare. Danger left signs. This didn't. There was no fortified position. No heavy weapon, no unnatural silence that suggested an ambush waiting to spring. What lay ahead didn't resemble anything they had been trained to fear, and that was the first mistake. German doctrine in World War II prized categorization. Every threat had a label. Every situation fit into a manual, a checklist, a response protocol. If something didn't fit a known category, it was mentally downgraded. And in war, what you don't recognize as dangerous is often what kills you. Not ignored, but deprioritized. The patrol did not see a weapon. They did not see an engineered obstacle. They saw something temporary, something improvised, something that looked unfinished. In other words, something beneath concern. This is how trained minds conserve energy in combat. You cannot treat everything as lethal. If you do, you freeze. So, soldiers learn to filter, and filters are where blind spots live. The patrol advanced the way experienced troops always do when they believe the situation is under control. Spacing consistent, weapons carried but not raised, attention drifting between terrain and routine. They were alert, just not alarmed. That difference is fatal because alarms trigger caution. Confidence triggers momentum. What made the trap invisible wasn't camouflage. It wasn't clever construction. It was the fact that it did not announce itself as a trap. There was no signature to recognize, no prior experience to reference, and without recognition, there was no reason to slow down. This wasn't arrogance. It was training doing exactly what it was designed to do. German patrols were taught to identify danger by pattern. They looked for repetition, symmetry, preparation. Real threats took time and effort. This took seconds, which meant in their minds it couldn't be decisive. That assumption was reinforced by something even deeper, the belief that lethal outcomes require proportional causes. Big losses come from big weapons. Small efforts create small effects. Nothing in their experience suggested otherwise, and war punishes assumptions harder than ignorance. What the patrol did not understand, what they could not understand, was that the trap was never meant to overpower them physically. It was designed to bypass judgment entirely, because the fastest way to defeat a trained soldier is not to overwhelm his firepower. It's to make him underestimate the situation long enough to react automatically. That moment hadn't arrived yet. At this stage, everything still felt ordinary. The path ahead was familiar. The terrain didn't demand caution. The obstacle didn't demand respect. No one halted the column. No one ordered a reassessment. No one said this doesn't feel right because nothing about it felt wrong enough, and that is the danger of experience. Experience teaches you what to fear, but it also teaches you what to dismiss. The patrol wasn't unlucky. They were predictable. They trusted a mental shortcut that had kept them alive dozens of times before. This time, that shortcut led straight into the kill zone. Not because the trap was brilliant, not because the patrol was incompetent, but because the situation exploited a rule every trained soldier follows. If something doesn't look dangerous, you don't treat it as if it is, and the trap depended entirely on that rule. By the time the patrol crossed the invisible line, by the time reaction replaced analysis, there would be no opportunity left to rethink that assumption. The dismissal had already done its work. The trap didn't come from planning. It came from shortage. By the time the unit found itself in this sector, nothing was ideal. Not the terrain, not the manpower, not the timing. There was no margin to prepare a textbook ambush, no time to recon for hours, no spare explosives to seed the route properly, no heavy weapons to lock down the approach. What they had was a narrow window and a problem that had to be solved. Now that's how most real decisions in war are made. Not with options, with constraints. The area itself offered no clean solution, too tight to maneuver freely, too exposed to wait for reinforcements, too predictable to improvise something elaborate, and most dangerous of all. The patrol was already moving. This is the part most historical accounts flatten into a sentence. Under pressure, the soldiers improvised, but pressure doesn't produce creativity. Pressure collapses choice. When time compresses, the brain doesn't search for the best option. It searches for the fastest acceptable one, and that distinction changes everything. The men responsible for setting the trap weren't trying to be clever. They weren't trying to invent doctrine. They weren't thinking about psychological blind spots. They were trying to buy seconds, seconds to disrupt momentum, seconds to break formation, seconds to force a reaction before the patrol reached a position where it could respond with overwhelming force. This wasn't about killing, not yet. It was about forcing the enemy to do something, anything that wasn't on their terms. The terrain narrowed their choices further. The route funneled movement into a predictable line, not because it was engineered that way, but because everything else was worse. Thick cover on both sides, limited visibility, ground that punished hesitation more than speed. The patrol had to pass through, which meant the question wasn't whether contact would happen, only how waiting wasn't an option. Withdrawal wasn't an option. A full ambush wasn't feasible. That left one category of action. Interference, not a wall, not a kill zone, not a decisive strike, just enough disruption to force the patrol out of its rhythm. This is where time quietly becomes the most important variable in the story, because when you have minutes to think, you reason. When you have seconds, you default. The men setting the trap understood this instinctively. Even if they couldn't have articulated it, they weren't asking what's the best trap, we as Ender. They were asking what can we do before the patrol arrives, walk David Divinity. That question alone eliminates 90% of possibilities. There was no time to build complexity. Complexity invites mistakes. Mistakes cost time, and time was already gone. So the solution had to meet three conditions. It had to be fast. It had to look harmless. And it had to provoke movement, not panic. Not fear movement, because movement exposes shape, spacing, intention. The goal wasn't to stop the patrol cold. That would trigger caution, discipline, control. The goal was to nudge it, to introduce a moment that demanded immediate reaction rather than careful thought. That's why the trap didn't look threatening. Threats slow people down. Ambiguity speeds them up. An ambiguous obstacle demands interpretation. Interpretation takes time. But under pressure, interpretation collapses into reflex, and reflex is predictable. Every decision made in those moments was shaped by the same invisible force, the clock. The patrol was moving on schedule. The unit setting the trap was behind schedule. That asymmetry matters. The patrol had confidence in time. They believed they controlled it. They could afford to assess, to investigate, to adapt. The defenders could not. They were operating inside a shrinking window where doing something imperfect was safer than doing nothing. So the trap didn't come from a doctrine manual, it came from subtraction. What can be done without preparation? What can be done without equipment? What can be done without giving the enemy time to think? The answer wasn't elegant. It wasn't durable. It wasn't even meant to last. It only needed to exist long enough to hijack attention. This is the part people misunderstand when they imagine improvisation as creativity under fire. Improvisation isn't about inspiration. It's about constraint. You don't invent, you select. You eliminate everything that takes time, training, or explanation. What remains is usually crude, and crude solutions are dangerous precisely because they don't signal danger. The men setting the trap didn't debate whether it would work. There was no time for that. Debate implies options. Options imply safety. They had neither. They acted because not acting meant losing control of the situation entirely. And that decision to act quickly rather than correctly is where the trap truly began. Not on the ground, not in the materials used, but in the enemy's timeline. Because the patrol was about to encounter something that demanded a response now. Not in a minute, not after analysis. Now that pressure would do what no weapon could. It would compress decision-making until instinct took over. By the time the patrol reached the critical point, there would be no space left for skepticism, only momentum. And momentum is hard to stop once it starts. The trap was never designed to defeat a patrol that had time to slow down. It was designed to meet a patrol that believed it couldn't afford to. That belief was the real setup. Everything else was just timing. 19 seconds doesn't sound like time. It's the length of a breath held too long. The pause before someone speaks again. The moment you hesitate before realizing you shouldn't have. In combat, 19 seconds is usually nothing. Here, it was everything. The men who built the trap didn't start counting out loud. There was no signal, no synchronization. They didn't have time for that. The clock started the moment they accepted there would be no second chance. Second one, a quick glance at the ground, not to admire terrain, but to confirm the obvious. There was no perfect spot. There never is. Second two, hands moved without discussion, not because they were calm, but because talking would slow them down. Second three, material was chosen not for strength, but for speed. Whatever was closest, whatever could be handled immediately. This wasn't construction. It was placement. Second for something went down where it wouldn't draw attention. Not hidden, not exposed just there. That was deliberate. Things that are hidden trigger suspicion. Things that are obvious trigger caution. This needed to be neither. Second five, a brief adjustment, not for precision, for plausibility. The trap didn't need to be perfect. It needed to look accidental. Second six, one man paused, not to rethink the plan, but to make sure nothing looked like a plan. That pause mattered because the fastest way to reveal intent is symmetry. Second seven, another hand moved, another small change, nothing that would be remembered later. Nothing anyone would point to and say, that's where it went wrong. Enter, first ding, second date. They stepped back half a pace. Distance creates perspective, and perspective reveals mistakes. There were none worth fixing. Second nine, someone almost overcorrected the instinct to make it cleaner, tighter, more deliberate. That instinct was suppressed. Deliberate means dangerous. Second 10, they stopped not because the trap was finished, but because time was gone. This is where most people imagined panic. There was none. Panic requires uncertainty. They had already accepted uncertainty the moment they began. What remained was something colder, finality. Second 11, a last look not at the trap but at the approach route. The patrol was close now. Not visible, but close enough that movement would soon become sound. Second 12, no one said anything, words of weight. Weight slows you down. Second 13, they withdrew, not dramatically, not cautiously. Just enough to disappear. Second 14, the trap existed on its own now. No adjustments, no improvements. Second 15. This is where most people misunderstand what made the trap dangerous. It wasn't what was built. It was the fact that no one had time to think about it. Second 16. There was no opportunity to ask, will this work? Ender. Questions take time. Answers take longer. Second 17. The trap didn't look threatening. It didn't look clever. It looked unfinished, which is exactly what made it invisible. Second 18. They were gone. Second 19, the last sound was not metal or wood. It was breathing, then silence. The 19 seconds ended. What followed belonged entirely to the patrol. This is where most reconstructions jump ahead. They describe the trap as if it were a thing with agency. As if it did something, it didn't. It waited. And waiting is disarming because nothing triggers suspicion faster than movement. And nothing suppresses it more effectively than stillness. The patrol approached at a steady pace, not rushed, not cautious, just fast enough to maintain rhythm. Rhythm matters. Rhythm is what keeps people from stopping to reassess. They were inside it now. The first man noticed something wasn't quite right. Not wrong, just different. Different is dangerous only when you have time to interpret it. He didn't. The formation was already committed. Behind him, spacing closed instinctively, not because of fear, because of habit. That habit had kept them alive before. This time, it worked against them. The next step wasn't a decision. It was a continuation. And continuations are powerful. Once momentum exists, stopping it requires effort, and effort requires awareness. Awareness requires time. They had none. This is the paradox of speed. The faster something is built, the harder it is to see. Not because it's hidden, but because the mind assumes anything dangerous would have taken longer. The patrol didn't think this is a trap. The scaps of they thought this is nothing. One is doubt grade. And that thought happened in less than a second. That's all the trap needed. What followed wasn't confusion. It was synchronization. One man reacted. The others mirrored, not consciously, automatically. Automatic response or efficient. They are also exploitable because automatic behavior is predictable. The trap didn't require strength. It didn't require precision. It required timing, and timing had already done the work. From the outside, it would later be described as sudden. From the inside, it didn't feel sudden at all. It felt like continuity. One step flowed into the next. One movement demanded another. That's how traps succeed without ever appearing dangerous. They don't interrupt behavior, they redirect it. The patrol's reactions were exactly what training demanded, and that was the fatal detail. Training optimizes for speed. Speed sacrifices skepticism. The men who built the trap didn't need to know what each soldier would do. They only needed to know that trained soldiers behave similarly under pressure. They compress, they bunch, they respond. The 19 seconds didn't create a device. They created a moment where instinct would outrun judgment. That moment was irreversible. By the time the patrol realized something had gone wrong, they were already acting on assumptions that no longer applied. And assumptions don't adapt quickly. That's the danger of moving fast. You commit before you understand. This is why the trap didn't need complexity. Complexity invites analysis. Analysis invites caution. Caution invites survival. Simplicity bypasses all three. The patrol didn't fail because they were slow. They failed because they were fast in the wrong place. Everything after that point unfolded mechanically, not chaotically. Mechanically, each reaction triggered the next. Each attempt to correct made things worse. Because the situation had already moved beyond decision making, it was now reaction making. The trap itself remained unchanged. It didn't escalate. It didn't adapt. It didn't need to. The patrol did all the work. That's what made the 19 seconds decisive, not because they were clever, but because they eliminated the one thing that saves people in war, time to think. Long after, analysts would try to isolate what part of the trap caused the collapse. They would look for leverage points, engineering flaws, tactical brilliance. They would miss the truth. The trap worked because it existed too briefly to be questioned and long enough to be obeyed. That window is rare and deadly. By the time the 19 seconds were over, the outcome was already locked in. Everything that followed was just consequence. The trap had done its job before anyone realized there was a trap at all. The first reaction didn't come from fear. It came from habit. The lead man adjusted his stride barely, not to stop, just enough to clear what he assumed was nothing. That assumption lasted less than a second. Behind him, spacing tightened automatically. No order was given. No signal passed down the line. This is what training does under pressure. It removes the need to ask. The patrol did exactly what they had practiced 100 times before, and that's why it worked against them. When the trap engaged, it didn't announce itself. There was no explosion, no unmistakable cue that said, "You are under attack," and so we work in half together. There was only disruption, a stumble, a sudden halt, a body moving where it wasn't supposed to be. That's all it takes to trigger reflex. The second man reacted to the first. The third reacted to the second. Reaction cascades faster than thought. In moments like this, the brain doesn't analyze, it matches. Someone moves, you move. Someone ducks, you duck. Someone freezes, you hesitate. The patrol's formation compressed without instruction, not because they were careless, because compression feels safe. Distance feels like exposure. Closeness feels like control. This is the lie reflex tells you. The trap didn't force them closer together. Their instincts did. By the time anyone realized spacing had collapsed, there was no room left to fix it. The first weapon came up not because someone had identified a target, but because uncertainty demands readiness. Weapons rise before questions form. That sequence matters. Once weapons are raised, the body commits. Commitment narrows options. At that point, everything becomes binary, advance or retreat. Fire or hold, move or freeze, nuance disappears. This is where reason dies. The first shout came too late to clarify anything. It added noise, not information. Noise accelerates reaction. Someone pivoted to cover a sector that didn't exist. Someone else mirrored the movement, assuming a threat had been spotted. No one had actually seen the enemy, but sight isn't required once reaction takes over. What matters is belief, and belief spreads faster than bullets. The patrol began responding to itself. That's the moment the trap truly sprung. Not when the obstacle engaged, but when the patrol's actions became the primary driver of events. Every movement created a new problem. Every correction amplified the last. Someone stumbled. Another tried to help. A third shifted position to compensate. Compensation is where formations break. Once the shape is lost, recovery requires calm. Calm requires time. There was none. The first shots were fired without a confirmed target. Not wildly, not panicked. Instinctively, because firing feels like taking control. That instinct is deadly in confined space. Sound ricocheted. Muzzle flashes appeared where no one expected them. Those flashes became reference points, false anchors in a situation already unraveling. People orient toward light and sound under stress. It's a survival shortcut. The trap exploited that shortcut perfectly. Men began reacting to echoes. By now, the patrol wasn't responding to the environment. They were responding to their own reactions. This is how discipline collapses. Not all at once, not dramatically. One reflex at a time. Orders tried to form. They couldn't compete with momentum. Command relies on pause. Pause relies on trust. Trust requires clarity. There was none. The patrol had crossed the point where thinking could intervene. Everything happening now was downstream. Downstream of compression. Downstream of reflex. Downstream of speed. The trap didn't dictate what they did next. It didn't need to, their training did. Training is designed to create speed under fire. Speed creates predictability. Predictability is exploitable. The men who set the trap understood this intuitively. They didn't need to know who would trip first. They only needed to know that someone would. Once that happened, the rest was mechanical. The patrol's attempts to regain control only deepened the problem. One man tried to pull back. Another stepped forward to cover. That split is lethal. Splits create angles. Angles create exposure. Exposure invites fire. At no point did the patrol stop to ask what was actually happening. Stopping would have required overriding instinct. Overriding instinct takes time and authority. They had neither. By now, the situation felt irreversible from the inside. That feeling matters. When people believe an outcome is already unfolding, they stop trying to change it and start trying to survive it. Survival narrows focus. Narrow focus blinds you to alternatives. The trap didn't remove options. It made them invisible. The patrol's movements became smaller, sharper, more frantic. Micro-decisions replaced strategy, cover that wasn't cover, angles that weren't safe, movements that solved one problem and created three more. This is the cost of reacting faster than you can understand. The first casualty fell without ceremony. No dramatic pause, no realization, just absence. Absence destabilizes groups faster than fear. Someone was suddenly not where they were supposed to be. That gap pulled attention inward. Inward attention is dangerous in combat. It means you're no longer reading the battlefield. You're reading your own unit. From that point on, The patrol was fighting itself. Not consciously, functionally. Every reaction was based on incomplete information. Every correction was based on a false assumption. This is how small disruptions turn catastrophic. Not through power, through timing. The trap didn't escalate. It remained exactly as it had been at second 19. What escalated was the patrol's internal chaos. Chaos doesn't require panic. It requires mismatch. Mismatch between expectation and reality. Mismatch between training and situation. Once that gap opens, it widens on its own. The patrol never realized they had lost control. They only felt that things were happening too fast to slow down, too fast to fix. That sensation, the sense of being dragged forward by events, is what kills experienced soldiers. Not ignorance, not incompetence. Momentum. By the time the moment passed, the patrol was no longer a coordinated unit. It was a collection of individuals responding to stimuli. That transformation took seconds, and once it happened, there was no going back. The trap had already finished its work, not by force, by letting reflex outrun reason. The trap didn't kill the patrol. The patrol killed itself. That distinction is uncomfortable and essential, because if the damage had come directly from the device, it would have been easy to explain. A weapon failed, a tactic succeeded, case closed, but that's not what happened. What unfolded next wasn't a single catastrophic moment. It was a chain reaction, each link forged by a perfectly reasonable decision made too late. The first casualty didn't signal disaster. Every patrol expects losses. Loss alone doesn't break units. What breaks them is what loss forces everyone else to do next. Someone stepped forward to fill the gap. That created another gap. Another man shifted to cover the shift that exposed an angle. Angles invite fire. Fire invites movement. Movement invites confusion. The damage didn't spread evenly. It cascaded. This is how trained formations fail under pressure. Not all at once, but asymmetrically. Some men advanced, others froze, others tried to pull back. Those responses weren't wrong in isolation. They were wrong together. Within seconds, spacing that had been drilled into muscle memory collapsed. Distances shortened, lines bent, and bent lines are fragile. A patrol functions on predictability. You know where the man beside you should be. You know where your coverage begins and ends. Once that geometry breaks, everything becomes guesswork. Guess slows reaction. Slowed reaction creates exposure. Exposure doesn't need heavy firepower to become lethal. It only needs timing. Shots came from places the patrol didn't expect, not because the enemy had moved, but because the patrol had every attempt to correct the situation made the situation harder to read. That's the cruel math of cascading failure. Each decision added variables faster than anyone could track them. From the outside, analysts would later try to count outcomes. They would note how many men went down, how quickly contact ended, how little ammunition was expended. Those numbers looked disproportionate. A handful of seconds, minimal preparation, maximum effect. But numbers alone missed the mechanism. The real damage wasn't physical. It was procedural. The patrol lost the ability to coordinate. That loss compounds faster than casualties ever could. When coordination fails, survival instincts take over. Survival instincts prioritize the self over the group. That shift is subtle, almost invisible. But once it happens, units stop behaving like units. They fragment. Fragmentation is deadly in confined space. Because fragments collide, men moving independently cross lines of fire they don't know exist. Cover assumed by one becomes exposure for another. Every movement solves one problem and creates two more. This is why the damage accelerated, not because the enemy was relentless, but because the patrol could no longer act as a single organism. The trap had severed that connection. Communication attempted to reassert control. It failed. Commands require shared understanding. Shared understanding requires stability. There was none. Orders arrived too late or addressed problems that no longer existed. By the time instructions were understood, the situation had already shifted. That lag is fatal because combat doesn't wait for clarity. It punishes it. At this point, the patrol wasn't being defeated by enemy action. They were being defeated by decision latency. Every half-second delay widened the gap between intention and reality, and that gap is where casualties multiply. Men who should have been covering were repositioning. Men who should have been moving were reassessing. Reassessment feels responsible. Under fire, it's lethal. The numbers began to climb, not all at once, not dramatically. One here, another there. Absence is accumulating. Absence is contagious. Each missing body removes both a weapon and a point of reference. Soon, no one knew what normal looked like anymore. That's when disproportion sets in. A situation that should have been survivable becomes catastrophic. Not because of force, but because of misalignment. The trap didn't create chaos. It created misalignment between expectation and reality, between training and environment, between speed and understanding. Those mismatches multiplied until recovery was no longer possible. At some point, the patrol crossed an invisible threshold. Beyond it, every action worsened the outcome. Pulling back exposed flanks, advancing compressed space. Holding position invited fire. There was no correct move left. That's when losses accelerate, not because men make stupid choices, but because all remaining choices are bad. The damage became undeniable. Bodies where there shouldn't have been bodies, silence where there should have been movement. The patrol's timeline collapsed, minutes blurred. What should have been a controlled withdrawal or a brief contact turned into something else entirely, a breakdown. By the time surviving members realized the engagement was unsalvageable, escape routes were compromised. Routes are only routes if you recognize them in time. Under stress, recognition narrows. People run toward familiarity, not safety. Familiarity is another trap. The patrol's final movements weren't reckless. They were desperate attempts to restore order in a system that no longer supported it. Desperation looks chaotic from the outside. From the inside, it feels logical. That's the final cruelty of cascading failure. Every step makes sense to the person taking it. It's only afterward that the pattern becomes visible. When the firing stopped, the imbalance was stark. The time invested versus the outcome achieved didn't align. Minimal setup, brief engagement, severe loss. That's why the aftermath was so difficult to explain. Reports struggled to capture causality. There was no single moment to point to, no dramatic breach, no overwhelming force, just a series of small decisions interacting in the worst possible way. This is why the damage felt disproportionate, because it wasn't inflicted all at once. It emerged like a crack spreading through glass after a tap that seemed harmless. The patrol didn't fall apart because they lacked discipline. They fell apart because discipline under the wrong conditions can accelerate failure instead of preventing it. The trap exploited that inversion. It turned strengths into liabilities, speed into haste, coordination into compression, training into predictability. By the end, the damage was undeniable, not because of what the trap did, but because of what it forced the patrol to do to itself. That's the lesson hidden beneath the numbers. Weapons cause casualties. Decisions cause collapses. And once a collapse begins, it doesn't need encouragement. It sustains itself. The trap didn't need to escalate. The patrol did that on its own. After the firing stopped, there was no moment of clarity, no clean conclusion, no obvious explanation that could be written down and understood at a glance. What remained was confusion, and confusion is uncomfortable for armies built on order. Survivors struggled to reconstruct what had happened, not because they were dishonest, but because the sequence refused to organize itself into something familiar. There was no single breach, no decisive enemy maneuver, no identifiable weapon that could be circled on a map and labeled. Only fragments, a moment where formation collapsed, a point where spacing vanished, a stretch of time that felt faster than it should have been. When reports were written, they reflected that discomfort. Language became vague enemy contact. If you walk-stalked unexpected resistance, where were one of the says to loss of cohesion, under fire 12, where abso these phrases appear precise they are not. They are placeholders, linguistic shields used when reality doesn't fit doctrine. Nowhere in the paperwork was there a sentence that said we were defeated by something too small to classify, end quote, because that sentence would have raised questions no one wanted to answer. Military reports are not designed to explore embarrassment. They are designed to restore confidence, and confidence requires simplification. So the incident was flattened. The trap was not described in detail. The sequence of reactions was compressed. The timeline was smoothed until it resembled something familiar. What couldn't be categorized was quietly omitted. This wasn't a cover-up. It was normalization. Armies do this instinctively. When faced with failure that challenges assumptions, they don't preserve the anomaly. They absorb it until it looks ordinary. That's how institutions survive, but it's also how lessons disappear. The most dangerous part of the event wasn't the loss itself. Losses can be replaced. What couldn't be replaced was certainty. The patrol's failure introduced an uncomfortable possibility, that disciplined, trained soldiers could be undone, without superior force, without surprise firepower, without obvious mistakes. That idea threatens the foundation of doctrine. Doctrine relies on predictability. If outcomes can be shaped by something so minor, then control is an illusion, and institutions do not function well on illusions exposed. So the event was reframed not as a collapse, but as a contact, not as a systemic failure, but as bad luck. Luck is safe. Luck absolves systems. Luck allows you to move on. Within days, the patrol became a footnote, mentioned but not examined, counted but not understood. No training manual was rewritten because of it. No doctrine updated. There was nothing to update. At least nothing anyone could point to. The trap had no name. The failure had no category. And things without categories don't survive institutional memory. This is why the story almost vanished. Not because it wasn't significant, but because it was too significant in the wrong way. It suggested that speed, discipline, and experience, the very traits armies prize, could become liabilities under certain conditions. That's not a lesson that spreads easily, especially in wartime. So the realization remained incomplete. Officers sensed something had gone wrong, but not how. They knew the patrol hadn't been outgunned. They knew the loss was disproportionate, but disproportion without explanation creates unease. Unease demands resolution. Resolution was found in abstraction, fog of war in white, friction, okay, unavoidable engagement. 19. Get marker. These phrases don't explain. They anesthetize. They dull the edge of uncertainty. But uncertainty is where real lessons live. The enemy too struggled to interpret what had happened. Interrogations yielded little clarity. Prisoners described confusion, sudden disarray, a sense that events had accelerated beyond control. No one mentioned a trap worth studying. No one could because the trap itself was never the point. What mattered was the sequence it triggered. And sequences are hard to capture on paper, especially when they implicate the mind. The realization when it came was quiet, not a revelation, but an unease that lingered without resolution, a feeling that something fundamental had been exposed and then deliberately ignored. That's how uncomfortable truths survive in history. They don't get erased, they get blurred, smoothed into language that sounds complete while saying very little. Over time, the incident faded further. Later operations followed familiar patterns. Training emphasized the same principles. The blind spot remained, not because it was hidden, but because acknowledging it would have required admitting that control is more fragile than doctrine suggests. History didn't forget the patrol. It rejected the implication, because the implication wasn't about tactics. It was about thinking. It suggested that battles are not always decided by who has more firepower or better positioning. Sometimes they are decided by who understands how quickly the human mind defaults to habit under pressure. That idea is dangerous not to enemies, but to certainty itself. So the realization stayed incomplete, unspoken, unwritten waiting, because blind spots don't disappear when they're ignored. They persist, they repeat, and they wait for the next moment when speed outruns understanding. What happened here wasn't extraordinary because of the trap. It was extraordinary because of what the trap exposed. For decades, war has been explained through hardware, bigger guns, thicker armor, faster machines. But this story points to something far less visible and far more decisive. Wars are not won only by who hits harder. They are won by who forces the other side to think incorrectly. The patrol didn't fail because they lacked courage. They didn't fail because they were poorly trained. They failed because under pressure, the human mind does what it is designed to do. It simplifies, it defaults to habit. It trusts patterns that worked before. It chooses speed over skepticism. And that is where blind spots live. Every army trains to reduce hesitation, to act faster than the enemy, to react without thinking. That training saves lives until it doesn't. Because when speed outruns understanding, discipline becomes predictability, and predictability can be weaponized. The trap built in 19 seconds didn't overpower anyone. It didn't outgun them. It didn't outnumber them. It simply arrived at the exact moment when trained reactions would take over from conscious thought. That moment exists in every conflict. It exists whenever time compresses, whenever pressure removes the luxury of doubt, whenever people are forced to decide before they can understand. History is full of moments like this, not always remembered, not always recorded clearly because they challenge a comforting belief that control comes from strength, preparation, and superior tools. In reality, control often comes from perception, from shaping what the enemy believes is happening, and when they believe it. That's why stories like this rarely sit comfortably in textbooks. They don't celebrate power. They expose fragility. They remind us that even the most disciplined systems depend on human minds, and human minds have limits. World War II wasn't decided only in factories or command rooms. It was decided in moments where someone understood how the other side would react under pressure and acted just fast enough to stay ahead of that reaction. This trap was one of those moments. Small, unremarkable, easy to dismiss and devastating because it didn't attack the body. It attacked the process. And processes once disrupted don't fail quietly, they unravel. That is the real lesson hidden behind 19 seconds. Not how to build a trap, but how easily certainty collapses. When speed replaces understanding, and why in war and beyond the most dangerous weapons are often the ones that never look like weapons at all.